Hey, I'm David Prue with Plantscape Solutions. We've been top dressing for probably a little over 10 years. We use the starter model, I guess that's the 150, then upgraded 2 years ago to the 250. The Ecolawn is a good machine, but you definitely have got to do some tweaks to it and have some mechanical skills, because if you think you got to take it to the dealership for every little thing, your machine's going to spend a lot of time at the dealership, and even the dealer does not know a lot of the ways you need to fix this machine to improve its reliability and prevent having issues. So let's start, I guess, with the front end. One of the things you absolutely must do to the 250 is the wheels that spin on the front, basically the agitator wheels almost, they're way too heavy for that bracket. Here's the bracket right here. Ecolawn actually sent me an extra bracket because mine was sagging. But the problem is, if I put the new bracket on, it's just going to sag again, because the bracket is just really thin metal and just cannot support the weight of the two gearboxes, the two agitating spinning wheels. It's just too much weight for the front of the machine. So what I did is I just happened to have some E-track that normally would go on the floor of an enclosed trailer and some cables, and it's a little adjuster in the middle which lets me exactly get the height exactly how I want it, because those wheels should be pretty much exactly parallel to the ground. If you have one of these machines and you have not rigged up something on the front, you're going to see your spinning wheels are not parallel to the ground. I will guarantee you they're sagging. If your machine is a year or more old, you're going to see that they're sagging a lot. They'll get to the point where you're basically just throwing your compost straight into the ground, 1 foot in front of the machine. Your spreading path is horrible. So you can see this is nothing more than Eco-Track on the front, all the way across the front. You know, this is a plastic bin, so you really want to make sure the spots on the bin where you attach to are spread out with a decent footprint. Do not use just 1 or 2 bolts into this plastic bin, because then what's going to happen is you're going to belong those holes and start messing up this bin, which I'm sure from Ecolawn that's probably a $400 or $500 part, and probably a couple $100 in shipping. So that is the first mod for the front of the machine that you absolutely must do from day one. Don't even use this machine without rigging that up. The other item that I got to credit Bo at Earthkind Services for, his tip, was we noticed the lever for the hopper door was pretty hard to use. And one of the things he mentioned is from Ecolawn, these set screws actually come fastened too tightly, so we're getting too much resistance on the actual bin door to open and close it, which is just a lot of extra hand strain when in a day you may open and close this thing hundreds of times. So loosen those up, and also during your work day, I definitely recommend keep a can of WD-40, spray it a few times a day, prevents material from clumping and getting stuck on the door, and it also helps it slide. You know, the other mod that I also did from day one in RI dirt bikes, so I actually took an old set of handlebars that I had and actually cut the end of the handlebar off and bolted it to the lever, because that lever is just way too short. So by adding some more leverage there, now it's extremely easy to operate. It's been sitting for a month. You could use a little oil, but it's still a world easier. I could open and close that all day, not going to have any hand strain whatsoever. I guess since we're back here, other mods we definitely recommend is the throttle cable on this from the factory is extremely hard to operate. So I've made 2 mods. The first mod I made was I took some washers and put them down here under the throttle cable, because the problem we had was the cable went down and then it had an abrupt angle change. So basically it was pinching the throttle cable. It really needs a throttle cable that's just a little bit longer, but I'm sure throttle cables come in increments of, you know, a few inches or something, where they just couldn't get a longer one. Maybe they don't realize they had the problem. So those washers helped a lot. Squirting a little WD-40 down the cable helped a lot. And then the other mod I recently made is this bolt on the adjuster arm for the carburetor. When it opens and closes from Honda is set just a little bit too tight for this application, and they probably set it that tight so when people are using this engine, which obviously is used in a ton of different applications, it actually stays in the setting that you set it at, and it doesn't walk a little bit with engine vibration. But this application does not need to be that tight, and it just creates more strain on the cable, and it's going to cause the cable to fail prematurely. So if you loosen that bolt up or nut just a little bit, I mean, the cable operates, I mean, just as smooth. This can be like butter, and you're probably going to get this cable to last years and years and years and never have an issue. A few other tweaks I did back here. You know, personally, I wish the rods on these things were more like a skag, where instead of being bent like this, they actually had a threaded rod going through there. So what I did is just put some washers on there. This way, when I'm activating it, the rods are not flopping back and forth as much. Just a little bit tighter play in the movements. Now, I'm definitely not a welder, but I started getting issues with a crack right across this plate. So I went out and spent $1,000 on a welder. And these are thick C-channel little brackets that put a stop to it. And what I've been meaning to do is actually add a plate to the bottom, because I knew that this frame also was just not really thick enough to deal the amount of stress. With a 150, I never had any issues. We were in that thing for, I don't even know, 7, 8, 9 years. But the problem with the 250 is you get 2 wheels on here, so it's more resistance when you're pushing it back and forth. So I welded these on to fix that crack, and now I'm getting a crack in the main frame down here. I had already planned to put a steel plate onto the bottom down there, because I knew that all this flex from the machine was definitely going to cause a problem for that frame. And sure enough, I procrastinated, and now there's a crack forming in that frame. So what I'm going to do is get a big piece of steel, and it's going to go probably all the way across here, because I really need a big clamping footprint to spread that force out to prevent ruining this frame. You know, as we walk around, here's another mod we've talked about before. On the old 150s, you came with a nice gap here, so there was no issues. But on the 250, this gap originally went straight up and down just about. It was very, very slightly beveled. So then the problem you get is you get any material that's sticking under the wheel, it causes the belt to swell. And within the first year, it swelled up multiple times, pushed Ecolawn's overpriced $350 belt into this and destroyed the belt. The belt didn't get worn out from normal wear and tear. It got destroyed because Ecolawn pretty much set the end users up for failure by not thinking about tolerances and things like that, which is just really a shame. And as we walk around, we also just leave the covers off the belts, at least this way, you know, we can see what's going on and know if there's any issue. I'm not really worried about OSHA and any safety issues. Same thing, just leave the cover off the side belts over here. Now this is another mod that I made. See if I can get a good shot of this. So what you're seeing right in there, and I've got some pictures of it as well, is that is a piece of angle iron in there with a piece of PVC bolted to it, and all I did is just bolted it to the top of the pillow bearings. So what that is doing is acting as a scraper, and it's pretty much almost touching this steel wheel right here, and it does not allow any clumping action on that wheel. So it keeps that wheel free at a really tight tolerance of just minute amounts of debris can stick to the wheel, and larger clumps that can stretch the belt, cannot happen. And that is once again something that Ecolawn really should put on that machine. I mean, end users can rig that up by themselves. Any piece of angle iron, all you've got to do is oblong the holes a little bit right here and basically bolt it right to the top of the pillow bearings. No modifications needed. It's an extremely easy mod to make. I thought about making a scraper to sell to people, but if you own an Ecolawn machine, you should definitely have the ability to make that mod yourself. And then as we back up, other things I recommend about this machine is when you buy it, check that chain under there, because when I bought this machine, you're actually supposed to have some nice slack in the chain like that. When I bought this machine, that chain was just as tight as can be. If you operate this machine with that chain over tightened, what's going to happen is every time you take off, it's going to put a shock wave down that drive line, and you're going to destroy your drive axle in record time. I mean, when you have slack in the chain, it acts like suspension on your vehicle, and it absorbs that shock wave, it'll make your axle last longer. Now on the axle topic, so the bottom axle is an axle I can get you for $265 plus shipping. The top axle is the axle you're going to buy from your local dealer. They buy it from Peerless. Peerless ships it to Ecolawn in Canada. Canada ships it to the distributor in Kansas, and then the Kansas distributor sends it to your dealer, and you buy it from the dealer. So when you have that many people in the food chain, an axle that should not cost very much money becomes extremely expensive. These axles are really not that well built, so it's extremely painful to spend, what, $400 plus on an axle, knowing that lots of times you may need to replace one axle a year. So if you call me, David with Plantscape Solutions, I can sell you the exact same axle as from Peerless. It's not a clone, not a copycat. It's the exact same axle for $265 versus over $400. And I can direct ship it to you from my source. The other things we're making are these wiper seals for the sides of conveyor belts. The belts that are in here now, the wiper seals, these are the aftermarket ones that we're having made. Because the problem with the Ecolawn ones is they're half as thick as that. What tends to happen really quickly is they tear. And the other thing we notice is they're not really long enough. They're a little bit too short, and it's also causing more material to get underneath of the conveyor belt and get into the wheels and cause problems. Now we still do use the Ecolawn strips on the back. That one really doesn't tear and it holds up okay. It doesn't take the abuse the hoppers on the side do. And on the same topic here, we also are selling these conveyor belts. We actually have a company that specializes in supplying conveyor belts to like aggregate and mining industries, so they're making extremely high quality, heavy duty stuff. So instead of paying Ecolawn, I don't even know, through your dealer anyway, what, maybe $350 plus for a conveyor belt, I can get you the exact same conveyor belt that is probably better quality for about $200 plus shipping. It's a part that shouldn't be that expensive from Ecolawn, your local dealer, but once again, Ecolawn is not making the part themselves. They're having a company make it. They buy it from the company, they sell it to the distributor sells it to the dealer, and you buy it from the dealer. And anytime you get that many people in the food chain and that much shipping going on, I mean, you're just taking a part that should not be that expensive and just beating up your end user and making them buy really overpriced parts. See if there's any other odds and ends I'm missing. Some other questions I always get asked are, tips for removing belts and things, the easiest way to do it. Sometimes I see people taking things apart, doing it really the hard way. So say if you have to actually replace the conveyor belt, what I recommend is get yourself a slide hammer. It may also be called a dent puller, but a slide hammer is really what it is, because it's extremely difficult to get this shaft pulled out from the end. But you can actually take the slide hammer, and there's actually an eye hole in the end of the shaft on the other side, and you can hook that slide hammer through the eye hole in the axle shaft, and it pulls out extremely easily. But if you try vice grips or a hammer or anything else to pull that shaft out, it is extremely difficult. But that slide hammer in 20 seconds will pull that shaft right out and make your job pretty easy. When you do put this thing back together, I definitely recommend put some grease inside of all of these tubes, and this will actually help prevent it from freezing up on you in the future and it being more difficult. We've also experimented with and without the support in here. Definitely recommend with. It takes just enough weight off the conveyor belts that your conveyor belt's going to last longer, especially if you have employees running these machines. I can't say this enough, do not overload the machine. Depending on what you're using in the machine, our stuff is fairly lightweight compost, 80% compost, 20% sand, as I try to just go for a level loaded machine about to here. Do not mount stuff up to here, because you're going to put extra tension on that belt, and once it starts to slip, that's it. You pretty much ruin it extremely quickly. Some other feedback. I'm not sure if I can get this angle on here. Let's try. So if we go all the way over to here, you will see, so the Ecolawn actually comes with this collar that goes on the outside of the support bearing, but what it doesn't come with is a collar right here that goes on the axle, because the number one thing that kills these axles is there is a bronze bushing in there that this axle rides on. There's no bearings or anything like that that support this axle and let it slide. It is strictly a bronze bushing. So what tends to happen over time is the axle starts to puke out that bronze bushing, and then your axle is ruined. But by putting one of these collars on here that has a set screw in it, you can make that bronze bushing stay in the axle housing where it belongs, and your axle is definitely going to last a lot longer. And what another person I was just talking to the other day mentioned is the support bearing nuts and bolts, that the nuts are not locking nuts, which they really should be. I actually had an axle failure earlier this year, and I thought maybe it was my fault that when I worked on it last time, maybe I had not tightened them up enough. And then he mentioned he had this exact same problem, and he mentioned that he thought it definitely was caused by the fact that these definitely should be lock nuts, or at the very least take them off, put some red Loctite on there and put them back on, because I'm pretty sure them not using lock nuts actually ruined my axle this year, because once the support came undone, the axle angle started to change and bend, and that was all she wrote. We're at a job and the axle just started going south on me. Now here's another issue with the Ecolawn. Here's the bracket, and you can see it has like a, I guess it's a C-channel type steel. So with the C-channel, the strength is actually in the vertical part of the C-channel. The lips on the bottom and the top really have no structural integrity, so they should have bolted it to the middle, but instead they bolted it to the bottom of the lip, which has no structural integrity. It bends extremely easily, so literally they pretty much set you up for failure. Where Ecolawn definitely should have, had a structural engineer give them some type of feedback when you're going to mass produce a machine, so you don't make a big blunder. Pardon me, when you're making the machine. And I'm not sure if there's anything I'm forgetting or not. Oh, also, when you're loading the machine, you've got to keep the area around this gas cap clean. There's actually vents in this cap. So if you allow material to get around that cap, what's going to happen is it'll clog the vents, and your gas tank's going to vapor lock, and the engine will not be able to get any fuel, and all of a sudden it'll start stalling on you, and you won't have any idea, what's going on. Definitely always turn off the gas when you're not using the machine, because it will gravity feed, and you'll have a rich condition, and it will be difficult to start. Other tips: do not use the tie downs on the back of the machine, and do not use the tie downs on the front of the machine, because they're just thin metal and they'll bend. Once again, Ecolawn is setting you up for failure by putting tie downs in spots that have no structural integrity. It'll bend. I mean, you can just look at this one. We usually use that one a few times and it just immediately bent. So we actually wrap the frame with a tie down in the front, and we go to the bearing support in the front when we tie it down. And I think that's about it. And I always welcome questions or some other quick feedback. So if your chain ever goes out, you don't need to take the whole machine apart like I've seen some people do. You can simply unbolt the axle on this side, unbolt the drive axle on the back, unbolt the other side, and let it hang down, and then you can pull the chain over and put a new chain off. There is no need to totally remove the rear shaft and totally remove the front. It's not that difficult. The same goes for the belt that goes for the front of the spinners. You do not need to totally destroy the machine to swap that belt out. Same thing, you can unbolt the axles, let them hang down, a little bit of disassembly required in the front, but it's not that hard to do that belt. With the machine, it's kind of trial and error, so hopefully if you did it the wrong way, you look at your actions and hopefully you learn from it. The machine is not that difficult to use, but you definitely would have to be mechanically inclined some, to keep this machine operating. But I have no regrets on buying this machine, and hopefully all these tips can, help some of you users, learn what I've learned. And some of this feedback came from Bo at Earthkind Services in Dallas, so I gotta give him a little kudos. Between he and I, we've both kind of come up with some different ideas to modify things. So hopefully this feedback is helpful.